The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, all summer you and I have been talking about the run-up to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit, which is now really just about a month away. It will happen in Beijing. Some 50 African leaders will descend on the Chinese capital for what really can be described as the biggest confab of the year for China-Africa relations. It happens every 3 years. And so many people focus on the big aid and financial assistance package numbers. So if you recall from 2015, 60 billion was the number. Prior to that, it was 20 billion. And that does capture the lion's share of headlines. But separate, away from the discussion of the money, there are a number of other tracks that are being discussed. And this is something that's very important to remember when we're thinking about FOCAC, is that it's not just about loans and resources. There is a lot going to be happening at this summit. And in preparation for the summit, all summer, we've been seeing developments in China related to FOCAC and these different tracks. So earlier in the summer, Cobus, you were in Beijing as part of the think tank forum. And so the Chinese brought over, let's say, dozens or hundreds of China-Africa analysts. And then earlier in the summer, even before that, was a 2-week affair where China brought over 50 military chiefs from various African countries. And that was really impressive. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation today, talking about the military aspect of the relationship and the preparation of what we're going to see at FOCAC. Cobus, based on what you saw in the think tank forum, what do you expect happened at the military chiefs forum?
It's an interesting question and one that I find a little bit difficult to answer because it was 2 weeks of African military chiefs essentially, touring bases and attending talks. It's quite opaque to me, but it is significant that China managed to get such high-level people there for so long. I think it does seem to indicate that there might be closer, military ties or, cooperation agreements might surface at FOCAC, because these forums they do the work of refining talking points and refining ideas in the run-up to FOCAC. But yeah, so it's very interesting for me to see, and it certainly indicates how the range of China-Africa cooperation is really expanding.
Now, the military relationship cannot be overstated with how important it's becoming in the China-Africa relationship. A lot of us have talked about the new military base in Djibouti. Others don't know that actually China is the single largest contributor of the UN Security Council permanent members, with more than 2,400 troops under Blue Helmet Command across Africa. There are combat-ready troops in South Sudan, in Mali. There are support operations going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The People's Armed Police, the PAP, are active in places like Liberia, mostly doing post-conflict stabilization. PLA forces were also involved in the Ebola crisis of several years ago. A lot of those were soldiers that were sent as well. So the military relationship is deepening. It's very, very complex. And so we thought it would be great to look into what is going to happen at FOCAC and where we are today in the military relationship. So we are so thrilled to have back on the show Assistant Professor Lina Benabdallah of Wake Forest University, where she is a professor of politics and international affairs. A very good afternoon to you, Lina.
Good afternoon, Eric and Cobus.
Well, Lina, thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate it. You recently wrote an article for the Washington Post, China-Africa military ties have deepened. Here are 4 things to know. Why don't you give us the headline of what are the 4 things that we need to know and what is so important right now at this moment in time about the China-Africa military relationship?
Right. I mean, some of the things you have discussed already in your introduction with Cobus, and these include sort of this idea that China is interested in build in closer ties to African countries in terms of defense and security, and is interested in portraying itself as a serious partner when it comes to defense and security. In a way, as you said, China has established itself as a very serious partner when it comes to economic relations, trade, investments, loans, development, etc. But this realm of defense and security is pretty much, we cannot say very new, but it's a gradually, China has gradually been increasing its ties and connections with African countries in this realm. So this forum does precisely that. It signals a big, serious interest on the part of China, and also 50 African countries sent either chief or senior military officials to this forum. So it was very well attended. So that also shows the willingness from the African side to participate in this conversation and to entertain this idea of dealing with China as a serious security partner. The other thing that I mentioned in the article is this idea of really building a strong web of networks, which I think is really critical, and I believe it to be sort of the core of the difference of China's foreign policy in Africa versus, say, other Western countries, and this idea of building a strong network and this idea of people-to-people connection. And I think that one of the biggest importances of this whole forum diplomacy, whether it's FOCAC or forum diplomacy for journalists or for military attaches, is this idea of bringing together everybody around the table and build and creating this personal connection and personal network, and expanding these networks with or between African and Chinese counterparts. And I think this is very important. So we already know that China has and conducts a ton of joint drills and live fire military exercises. There are all kinds of such things happening all the time. But the significance of this forum is definitely to bring everybody together to the table, is to create this impact of flying in all these high military officials to China to see the capabilities of China. And this is a third point that I mentioned, is this it's a marketing strategy in a sense also for China's capabilities, both in terms of armaments, equipments. As Cobus mentioned, we imagine that there were lots of visits during these 2 weeks. And I also imagine that the visits must have included also equipments and armaments and hardware. And I think that also sort of sells a little bit this idea of China as a power, as a strong power, and it markets in a way Chinese weapons. And we know that China already is a big seller of small weapons to African countries, but not necessarily big hardware and armaments. And I think that this forum serves as that, as sort of is given this image and marketization of Chinese equipments, Chinese knowledge, Chinese know-how in terms of military capabilities. And I think, as I said in the article, the other thing that this forum shows us is there's a certain pattern to whenever there's something new in terms of Chinese diplomacy or foreign policy, it happens to be with African countries. So the first forum diplomacy was FOCAC, as you guys mentioned, and it was in the year 2000 with African countries. The first military base was in Africa. The first lots of things happened with Africa. So in my imagination, this forum diplomacy for military attaches is not going to just stop with Africans. And I think that testing the waters, so to speak, with African military attaches might give a launching pad for doing similar thing with other regions.
That's a very important point. You know, if you look at China's relationship with Africa, what are China's biggest strategic preoccupations in relation to Africa? They have the base there. They're focusing a lot on peacekeeping, and particularly kind of relatively geographically contained peacekeeping. But, you know, this forum seems to also suggest that they're making plans for larger, wider engagement in the future. Can you give us an idea of what some of China's strategic priorities might be?
I think you've already touched on some of the most important ones. China is, as you mentioned, both the largest contributor among the UN peacekeeping permanent members of troops, but also the second largest financing power for peacekeeping missions for the UN. And China wants to continue to do that. And in a way, both in terms of training or providing peacekeepers on the ground, but also training peacekeepers, training lots of African peacekeepers in China, and now and in the future. So there's a big focus on that as well. But second, I think, another strategic interest is the simple self-interested or self-motivated protection of Chinese businesses and Chinese interests. I mean, we all remember the backdrop of what happened in Libya, for example, and that sort of showed a huge gap in China's preparedness to do something about that. And I think that that's a huge self-motivation there. I mean, thirdly, I think, as you mentioned, there's a big focus and interest in this Belt and Road Initiative, and that comes with the idea of having to have, well, first of all, there's the military or the naval base in Djibouti, but there are talks here and there about that not being the first one or the only one. And that might have to do with the maritime belt or maritime aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative. And if that is to continue, if this trend is to continue, we will see China being more and more interested in having a big role to play in the security of the Indian Ocean. And with that, we will have to come to this idea of having more and more close ties with or naval presence along the coast, and so we might see increasing interest and involvement in that in the future.
I'd like for you to talk and address the sensitivities about foreign military presences in Africa, given the history, which has been nothing short of atrocious. There's understandably a lot of apprehension about increased Chinese engagement because they say it fits into a narrative of neocolonialism, imperialism, in part because the memories are still fresh in a lot of people's minds of what it was when the French military, the British military, the Germans, the Italians were all there. Even during the Cold War, the Americans and what they did to intervene in domestic African politics. Do you think that the Chinese have an understanding of the sensitivity related to the colonial and imperialism narrative, which they should given their own history? And what do you think they're doing to address that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, not long ago, in the very, very, very short recent memory, I mean, like 5 years ago, whenever we talk about China's foreign policy in Africa, first thing that comes in the rhetoric is non-interference. And this signals sort of a big shift away from this non-interference principle, which for the longest time has been a big characteristic of China-Africa relations. And so you do raise a really important point and question there. And it's really interesting, and it will be interesting to see how in the future this is going to be reconciled. As for now, what we see is, I mean, the Chinese government is absolutely 100% aware of these criticisms that are leveled against this idea of foreign and military or foreign presence on African soil. And I think that the difference or what's been done right now to maybe mitigate for that is, first of all, if you look at it, the Djibouti base and the way that the deal was signed with Djibouti about the naval base, it included a huge package of a number of things. So it was not just a military base, but it was a huge economic deal, a huge economic package to build a big new city, basically, in Djibouti. And that it comes with a lot of economic opportunities. The way it is, at least the way that the deal is framed, and lots of infrastructure, lots of, I think it was also technology transfers. And what I'm trying to say here is blending the economic aspect with security aspect is a brand for China's defense diplomacy in Africa. And I think that blending them gives it a different product, something different from what these historical examples tell us about foreign presence on African soil. And I think, the result we'll have to see, right? So this is something that we keep reading in articles in the about sort of Chinese largesse in Djibouti and how that might result in huge debt, and that might result in, there are lots of doubts and lots of fears. But what I'm trying to say is there are differences between the way that China is framing and couching this military base in Djibouti and the usual bases or the usual sort of clear foreign or clear interference in domestic politics in that sense. So I think we'll have to see what the results of this are. But I definitely think that both sides are very much aware of the experiences of the African, countries with foreign powers and also China.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
You point out that this defense forum probably was a mix of a lot of talk about peacekeeping, but also a lot of demonstrations of new weapons and possibly leading to more arms sales. And China's already, as you pointed out, quite a large supplier of small arms to Africa. How worried is the Chinese government, do you think, about that contradiction? We already saw 2 Chinese peacekeepers were killed in South Sudan, and in an area where China had sold weapons to some of the participants in the conflict. How worried do you think they are that their own peacekeepers are going to be killed by Chinese arms in Africa?
Yeah, it's a very good point. There was a couple of cases. I think you mentioned South Sudan. There were a few cases where some actually Chinese peacekeepers were said to be shot by guns that were sold by Chinese or Chinese-made guns, basically, or weapons. And I think that created a big scandal, and it created this whole criticism of the hypocrisy of the game. So if one country is actually contributing the largest number of peacekeepers, what about this idea of selling weapons? And I think that at some point it comes. It's not just the case of China, and it's at some point it's this huge big problem with maybe a disconnection between the arms sales, what's going on with that. Who's responsible for it, where it's coming from, where it's going, and what are the routes, how does it make it to certain conflict zones, and the UN organs or the UN peacekeeping troops. In a sense, it seems that there is somewhere a gap between those two, because the same China that's contributing to peacekeeping troops cannot be the same China that's selling weapons to both warring factions, actually. So essentially, there seems to be a little bit of a lack of experience. It seems to be a lack of communication or disjointed, basically, operations there. And I don't know how big that is, or if it's something that we still see today, or if those were isolated cases. I don't know if the Chinese government is taking any measures towards fixing this, but it makes for a really big sort of image or reputation stunt actually for Chinese foreign policy when it comes to these things, and those cases actually were talked about time and time again. So I wonder if, I don't know if there has been any measures taken. It's not something, as you know, it's not something we can track easily this idea of arms sales. So it's not something that we can tell.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We saw that several years ago, actually 5 or 6 years ago, back in South Sudan, where the diplomatic side said that they were putting an arms embargo and joining up with the United Nations on their arms embargo in South Sudan, and yet Norinco, one of the large state-owned weapons manufacturers, was caught selling around $38 million of small arms to the South Sudanese government. And so it kind of showed you that both hands don't always work in sync with one another. And it's not surprising for a government and an organization as large as the Chinese. This is very, very common in the United States, where America's own arms vendors are oftentimes selling to entities which are not aligned with U.S. foreign policy. And I think we have to apply the same kind of criteria to that it's impossible for the Americans to govern that as effectively as they want to, just as it is for the Chinese. Although we haven't heard reports of that in recent years. So it might be that they've got this under control. But again, Norinco and these other Chinese arms manufacturers are not always aligned or communicating with the foreign policy and the defense establishment. They're out there to make money. And that's, I think, what their priorities are.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, I mean, there's basically 2 weeks ago, there was a new embargo imposed by the UN Security Council on South Sudan. I mean, an embargo on arms, an arms embargo, basically. And so, yeah, I mean, the resolution was actually drafted, by the US. And I mean, like we'll see, as you said, in a few years, whether this will be a good testing ground for whether things have changed or not. But yeah.
Very quickly, just I want to get your take on where we are at this moment in history. And this is the Donald Trump question that comes up, because the United States recently announced that it is going to be actually pulling resources out of Africa in terms of its fight against terrorism and military resources. And I'm wondering if African governments are now going to start looking more to the Chinese for this kind of assistance that the United States may have once provided. And does this provide the Chinese an opportunity to start building deeper relationships with African militaries if, in fact, the U.S. is starting to retrench a little bit?
Yeah, I think the one big advantage or competitive advantage to Chinese foreign policy in Africa has been the continuity. I mean, you look at it like the past 18 years have been pretty much the same trend, and it's just gradually increasing. There hasn't been, every 5 years or every 4 years, there's a different administration, there's a different ideology, there's a different practices on the ground. So I think one of China's competitive advantages here is that, and I think that creates and makes for strong networks, strong connections, strong relations with African countries. They know it's solid, and they know it's consistent in that regard, so far anyway. And I don't know in terms of replacing the U.S. for providing troops or being a huge security presence in the continent. I don't necessarily see that happening as deeply as the U.S. has been involved, say, with AFRICOM or with the U.S. Africa Command. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. I mean, I think that there are limits to what the Chinese government might be willing to do. And I don't think that being involved in fighting Boko Haram in a way that AFRICOM is, or being involved in ways that are more or less long-term is one priority for the Chinese government. And so I mean, remains to see. But as you noted, the trends seem to be going opposite directions. While U.S. military interests are seeming, I mean, the new administration seem to be basically decreasing or pulling out. Chinese Africa military ties seem to gradually be increasing. So there's definitely something to observe there.
Finally, I was wondering, a lot of your work focuses on Chinese training of foreign officials, including politicians. I wonder if you can just give us a scale of how many, particularly African military personnel is trained in China annually. Like, what is the kind of scale of this exchange?
So the scale of the exchange is that, so there are several types of trainings, and there are trainings for police troops, there are trainings for military attaches. There are trainings that are short-term and others that are long-term. And there are some countries in Africa that send annual delegations. They will have a certain quota, say of 30, for example, military attaches. Every year they send a delegation to China. But there are some training programs that are more or less not bilateral, but negotiated more or less with the entire continent, and everybody sends an attaché. So there are really different formulas for them. And more recently, or most recently, there's been a new addition to this, which is training for peacekeepers, and that's new. The number for peacekeepers was clear, and it's something that Xi Jinping pronounced during his trip to the UN, addressing the UN. And the idea was to provide trainings for 1,000 peacekeeping troops, for African peacekeeping troops. To that extent, that number is clear. The trainings provided for also the African Union standby force are also clear. But in terms of telling you how many of the African, say, high military officials visit China for trainings, those numbers are really, really kind of difficult to come by. In terms of what goes on in the trainings, I mean, it's a combination of seminars. Depends on which kind of units. Could be seminars. It could be actual training tactics, training in practical tactics. And a lot of it also includes witnessing or watching demonstrations by Chinese troops, and visiting different facilities, and also just visiting different parts of China. So these seem to be the trends that are common to all the trainings. And I mean, I don't know where I heard this, and I don't know how true it is, but there's an anecdote that says somewhere that says that every African country has at least one high military official that's been trained in China. And I've heard this maybe like 3 or 4 years ago when I was doing field work in China. But I'm pretty sure that if that's true, the numbers are even higher now. And I think because of the continuity of what's going on, you would expect to see more and more of these numbers increasing.
This is one of the least understood but most important aspects of the China-Africa relationship, and one that will be a topic of considerable discussion at the upcoming Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit in Beijing in September. If you are interested in this, there is an article that you must read. China-Africa military ties have deepened. Here are 4 things to know. It's in the Washington Post. We'll put a link to it on the podcast page in the show notes and also on our website. It was written by Lina Benabdallah. Lina, thank you so much for joining us. Lina is an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University and really one of the great China-Africa scholars of our time. So we really appreciate your time today to walk us through the military relationship.
Thank you guys for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on the show.
Oh, it's great. And if people want to follow what you're reading and writing these days, what's the best way they can stay in touch with you?
I think Twitter might be the best way to stay in touch with me. My Twitter handle is @LBENABDALLAH. That's L Benabdallah.
We will, of course, put a link to that also in our show notes as well so people can connect with you. So, Lina, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we're going to follow up with you after FOCAC to kind of get a debrief of what happened on the military front.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you very much.
Cobus, I think the most interesting point that Lina made was related to the non-interference doctrine. And this is this really important concept in Chinese foreign policy that is undergoing a profound change. So for much of the history from 1949, really up until the present, China had this idea that it would not interfere in the internal affairs of another country. And for the most part, it has respected that. But now with the new anti-terrorism law that was passed in 2015 that gave the president authorization to intervene in other countries' affairs in order to protect Chinese interests and people. And now with the deployment of Chinese forces around the world into different areas and different theaters and arenas, that doctrine is coming under a challenge right now. And Luke Patey, who is one of the other kind of just really kick-ass China-Africa scholars. And he writes a lot on South Sudan and Sudan. He wrote that really the non-interference doctrine is coming to an end for the most part. He wrote that on Twitter a couple weeks ago. And I thought that was so interesting to consider that as China's military relationships in Africa deepen, it's going to run up against some of these benchmark and these bedrock foreign policy doctrines that they've had for decades. And it's going to force a change. And I'm wondering how they are going to articulate that and not abandon their core principles.
It's also going to be very interesting to see what the African reaction is to this, because so much of the pro-China side of African discussion is around the no strings attached, hands off, mode that China has pursued in Africa, where they don't interfere in internal affairs. The concept of something like regime change is really a poisonous one in Africa, especially after the Gaddafi incident. So
but you'll never see the Chinese, and that's poisonous for the Chinese as well. So I don't see the Chinese engaging in any type of regime change. I mean, they were immediately turned off by what happened in Libya. I mean, that was something that they didn't like at all.
No, of course, but what I mean is more that I also don't anticipate the Chinese actually doing even moving in that direction. But what I mean is that there's a very strong already set up narrative running in Africa about external powers trying to intervene in Africa in kind of neo-colonial ways, in which kind of the phrase regime change has taken on this additional kind of weight, so you see, like Robert Mugabe was always going on about how everyone is planning to do regime change on him. It's this kind of catch-all thing that African governments use as a way to shore up domestic support, even when what they're doing is not above board. It'll be very interesting to see whether China gets pulled into these kind of discussions.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the example of Zimbabwe, because that may actually reveal more about how China's military may intervene in African politics than anything else. Because when Emerson Mnangagwa was on his way up the power chain to execute was effectively a coup. The Zimbabwe military and Emerson himself went to China and to Beijing to talk to Chinese leaders. We don't know what was said. We don't know what was done there, but it was certainly interesting to watch how the Chinese government and potentially even the Chinese military was advising the new Zimbabwe leadership and giving their tacit support. We don't know, but there was some communication, and it didn't happen with the British or the Americans or the South Africans. It happened with the Chinese.
No, actually, sorry to interrupt you. It did happen with the South Africans. It wasn't just the Chinese. They contacted South Africa as well. So the two countries were kind of informed beforehand that this is probably going to happen, I think.
Now, but do you think that is revealing in any ways in terms of the military-to-military relationships and how these relationships will play out in politics?
I think it's more revealing of the kind of investment and economic weight of South Africa and China in Zimbabwe. Because of the Western sanctions, the Brits weren't as big a factor anymore, and so South Africa and China were the two biggest actors who could cause problems. And so I think they were informed beforehand.
Well, this is a complex, interesting, fascinating, and very rapidly changing topic. Again, in addition to Lina Benabdallah, I do recommend you check out Luke Patey, and you can follow him on Twitter at Luke Patey. That's Luke Patey. He is a scholar in Denmark at the Danish Institute for International Affairs, and he's also the author of The New Kings of Crude. He writes and tweets a lot about Chinese military affairs in Africa, and it's an absolutely fascinating topic to follow, and again, one that we're going to follow very closely at the upcoming FOCAC summit in Beijing coming up in September. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.